I know many of you will be familiar with UK Lawyers for Israel, but we have record-breaking attendance tonight. And in the circumstances, I've been asked to say a few words about this organisation. UKLFI is a voluntary association of lawyers who are committed to using legal expertise to safeguard the rights of Israel. Our work is critical, especially in today's climate where anti-Semitism is rife, and misrepresentations of the law in respect of Israel pose significant challenges. For over a decade, we have operated across arenas, from the academy to the workplace, to exposing individuals affiliated with prescribed groups or entities fundraising for terror, to challenging false allegations against Israel in international courts. UKLFI remains on the front line, advocating for justice and fair representation and combating Jew hate. We've successfully influenced policy decisions and legal outcomes, ensuring that the law is upheld and the truth about Israel's situation and legal position is heard and respected. Each matter we undertake, each victory we secure, contributes to a safer, more just world and helps the Jewish community and Israel's supporters. And now more than ever, we rely on your support to continue this vital work. You can learn more about our impact and initiatives on the website and by following us on Twitter. And your donations empower us to answer the ever-increasing calls for assistance and to pursue justice and defend Israel against lawfare. Together, we can make a significant difference. Nowhere has the impact of lawfare been more apparent over the last month than with respect to the law of armed conflict. It is therefore more important than ever that we examine the conduct of the current Gaza conflict by Hamas and other terrorist groups and by Israel in the accurate legal framework, and to address these challenges that have to be confronted and the decisions that have to be made in urban asymmetric armed conflict, the application of the law of armed conflict and its impact on strategy and military outcomes. To address all of these subjects, I'm delighted to be joined by friends and colleagues with on-the-ground experience of the application of law to war. Professor Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Corn is the George R. Killam Jr. Chair of Criminal Law and Director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University. He served in the US Army for 21 years as an officer and a final year as a civilian legal advisor. He was a tactical intelligence officer in Panama, supervisory defense counsel for the Western US, Chief of International Law for US Army Europe, and Professor of International and National Security Law at the US Army Judge Advocate General School. He was also Chief Prosecutor for the 101st Airborne Division, a senior law of war expert, as well as the author of many texts on the subject. I'm also delighted to introduce Colonel Richard Kemp, CBE, who spent most of his 30-year career in the British Army fighting terrorism and insurgency. He commanded British forces, including in Afghanistan, Iraq, Northern Ireland, and the Balkans. From 2002 to 2006, he headed the International Terrorism Team at the UK government's Joint Intelligence Committee, and he also chaired the Strategic Intelligence Group at COBRA, the UK's National Crisis Management Committee. He's been present during each of the conflicts between Israel and Hamas since Operation Cast Lead in 2008, and he's been in Israel since the start of the current war in Gaza. He's also been present at the front line during the war in Ukraine. May I begin, gentlemen, by asking you, Richard, to speak to what you have seen over the last few weeks and address the considerations in the operational military side.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and it's a real pleasure to join this webinar. I have huge admiration for the work that UKLFI does. It's incredibly valuable. And anyone who is in a position to support the work of UKLFI, I would strongly urge you to do so. It's also a real pleasure to be here on this panel with you, Natasha, one of the most articulate and persuasive experts on international law as it affects the battlefield. And we've seen some very impressive articles recently from you in papers such as The Telegraph, and some very, very persuasive commentary on the BBC and other media. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and also with Geoffrey Corn, who I also know very well, one of the foremost experts on the laws of war, with not only theoretical but also significant practical experience. So without further ado, I, as Natasha said, I've been here in Israel since the start of this war. I've visited the front lines in Gaza and in the north in Lebanon. I've spoken to many IDF soldiers and commanders over that time, as well as politicians in Israel. I've visited some of the scenes of the worst horrors that took place on October the 7th, particularly Kfar Aza and Sderot. And if ever I saw, apart from what I've learnt by watching media and watching videos, etc., if ever I saw a cause of war, a just cause of war, then that is it. And I don't think there's any right-thinking person can have any doubt about the IDF's. I wouldn't describe it as a right to defend itself. No one ever talks about Ukraine's right to defend itself, but Israel has an absolute duty to defend itself. The government has a duty to deal with this tremendous threat that materialized on the 7th of October and will materialize again and again unless it is defeated. I want to run through some of the military challenges that the IDF are facing and have faced. And then I think, Natasha, I think I'm right in saying Geoffrey Corn will delve more into the legal aspects of it. I'm far from being clever enough to be a lawyer. So although I have on many occasions, I have put into practice issues, principles such as proportionality, distinction, etc., that we're pretty familiar with on the battlefield. So I obviously, as the military commander, I had to be well aware of all of this, but I don't consider myself to be an expert on the level of Natasha or Geoffrey. But what we're facing, what the IDF is facing in Gaza, and I'm trying to look at this through the eyes of, let's say, the chief of staff or a senior commander in the IDF. Now, for your benefit, what we're looking at in Gaza is an enemy that, before it carried out its attacks on the 7th of October, knew what the consequence would be. They knew that the IDF would be coming into Gaza either from the air or from the ground or both. And they knew that they would be fighting a battle inside Gaza of one sort or another. And therefore, they had plenty of time to prepare the ground. And they will have prepared that ground very effectively in terms of booby traps, minefields, sniper positions, machine gun positions, ambushes, and the like, in the open areas and in the urban areas. And so when my troops went into Gaza, if I was an IDF commander, I would know they were facing very, very dangerous conditions. Of course, the 3-week air campaign that preceded the ground operation will have had the effect of significantly softening up the enemy in Gaza, and that was the purpose of maintaining an assault on Hamas for 3 weeks before the ground forces went in, to do as much damage to the enemy as possible, to make the task of the ground force as easy as possible. And that consisted of specific targeting of enemy positions, command posts, weapons positions, launch platforms, headquarters, and other apparatus of the Gaza terrorist machinery inside Gaza. Now, obviously, given the fact that the enemy fight from within the civilian population, despite the fact that I was targeting specific enemy targets, military targets, there were, of course, unfortunately, civilian casualties by definition, and that they would be caused, despite my efforts at warning the civilians to leave, that would be caused by some civilians refusing to go, not wanting to go, being forced to stay by Hamas, and also by, in some cases, secondary effects. For example, if I decided to fire ammunition at a building that may well have been unknown to me, may well have been significant weapons storage there as well, which could have made the effect of my explosive much greater. Or alternatively, and I think we saw this in at least one, probably more cases, a building is attacked, a tunnel collapses underneath the building and brings down other buildings with it, because as you all know, I'm sure there's a very extensive tunnel network underneath Gaza. So despite all of the efforts made to kill terrorists without with the minimum possible harm to civilians, civilians are going to die, and it's impossible to carry out an operation of this sort without civilians dying. And I, as a military commander, I would know that, and I would take every possible step, and I know the IDF took every possible step to avoid it, including things like millions of text messages, millions of voice messages, millions of leaflets dropped, phone calls, hundreds of thousands of phone calls made to warn people to either to leave a specific area or generally to leave the area of northern Gaza, which I knew was going to be the most intensive place I'd be attacking. And then the ground operation, of course, is another dimension. After 3 weeks, the ground operation has now been running for almost another 3 weeks, getting on to certainly 2.5 weeks. And that brings with it, in addition to the dangers I've mentioned already, other dangers. From the air, of course, my air forces are relatively invulnerable, not totally, but relatively. They can strike without being in much danger themselves. On the ground, it's a different story. I mentioned the mines, booby traps, ambush positions, sniper positions, and all the rest of it, including anti-tank launchers against my armored vehicles. And so what I would have to do is and what the IDF did is to launch a very rapid attack into Gaza with the maximum possible force in order to encircle Gaza City and close off escape routes for terrorists either to the north or to the south of Gaza City, so that I could then enter the city and destroy as many of the terrorists as possible. At the same time, because I wanted more civilians to leave than had already left, I was able to open humanitarian corridors, protect humanitarian corridors, and give humanitarian pauses from time to time to allow people to leave. And that's exactly what the IDF did, despite Hamas's efforts to prevent that happening, because, of course, they want the human shields to remain in place. And so we've seen scenes of Hamas killing civilians attempting to leave, which some media, in the same way as they generally, in many cases, the media generally try and portray Israel as being the bad guys in this. In some cases, media tried to show Hamas killings of civilians leaving as being IDF killings, and that's pretty common, pretty standard practice in the media. And then the problem, of course, occurs in fighting in built-up areas. It's very, very difficult for me to fight in streets and buildings with their short fields of fire. Plenty of opportunities for people to hide, to carry out attacks against me, to put booby traps in place. For that, I need to keep the tanks with me as well, but they're very vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. I need infantry on the ground. I need engineers to blow holes into buildings so I can enter buildings. I also need to go into the tunnel complexes in order to gain intelligence and, if possible, to rescue hostages, because the thing I haven't mentioned yet, the critical part of my mission, is to rescue those hostages, and that's probably the most demanding aspect of the mission I have. So, in summary, I have to do all I can to kill the terrorists. I have to do all I can to try and avoid killing innocent civilians. I have to do all I can to try and prevent my own soldiers from dying in too large numbers. Obviously, a soldier's life is worth no less than an innocent civilian's life. And at the same time, I have to try and rescue the hostages. And in order to try and starve Hamas of supplies, I also have to impose a blockade, a siege, if you like, on areas of Gaza to prevent critical supplies, particularly fuel, getting into Hamas. And you know, that all of that is very, very complicated, very, very difficult. So far, from what I've seen, the IDF have done a phenomenal job. They've done it much more quickly than was expected, and they've sustained fewer casualties, about 40, fewer than I think was expected. The job's far from over now, and I think the major part of the operation, or one of the most important parts of the operation, begins now with the need to clear Shifa Hospital of terrorists, and then to begin to focus on the southern part of Gaza City.
Richard, thank you so much for that overview of the immense strategic challenges facing the IDF at the present time. We've already had many questions coming in, but before we get to them, Geoff, may I ask you, in light of the strategic challenges that Israel is facing, to highlight the key aspects of the law of armed conflict that governs Israel's approach here? And we all know that, unfortunately, they're being badly misrepresented in the press coverage. Perhaps you can set the record straight on some of the key aspects of this.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this and giving me the opportunity. I always enjoy being partnered with Colonel Kemp. I think it's a nice connection, and he always sets the conditions so perfectly for the challenge of battle command. And I think one of the things that really corrupts the public discourse on this conflict or any conflict is the overall inability to appreciate the true nature of that challenge. You're walking a tightrope between the violent application of combat power and the moral obligation to preserve lines of humanity and limits on the brutality of war. And when you're fighting an enemy that has no consideration for that second piece of it, for the morality, it makes it all that more difficult. What I'd like to do is focus on a couple of points that I think have been central to a lot of the misinformation and misunderstanding of what we're seeing and how to properly assess it. Let's start with the right of self-defense. A nation has a right to defend itself no differently than an individual has a right to defend herself if somebody attacks her violently on the street. It's not a tit-for-tat equation. And we don't assess self-defense by comparing casualties. There's no validity in saying, well, you lost 2,000 people, so once you kill more than 2,000 people on the other side of the border or the barrier, then you've exceeded your right of self-defense. Self-defense is a principle of necessity. It gives the victim the authority to take all measures that are necessary in order to restore the status quo of safety. And what Hamas demonstrated on October 7th was that Israel's assumptions that it could preserve its safety primarily by reliance on a defensive shield, defensive measures, was thrown in the ash bin. And so it's become clear that the only way to satisfy the legitimate objectives of strategic self-defense are to completely destroy the combat or military capability of this non-state group. As Colonel Kemp knows, destroy is a tactical mission. It's a task that's given to operational commanders. It means to disable your enemy's ability to conduct operations without substantial reconstitution. And that's what we're seeing happen now. So we need to reject this notion that you've done enough now, so we should implement an immediate ceasefire, because that doesn't satisfy the ultimate necessity of self-defense. Another important point. The law of war is premised on a notion of equality of obligation. There's no disparate application of the law, whether you're a state or a non-state group. Hamas is obligated to follow the rules no differently than the Israeli Defense Forces are, nor is there any exception to the law for the reason you might be fighting. So even if there are people out there who believe, I think completely erroneously, that Hamas is somehow advancing the cause of Palestinian self-determination, that doesn't give Hamas the right to ignore the basic rules of war. And this is a constant problem that we face in the discourse, that, well, they're fighting a more effective enemy. Shouldn't they be able to do things differently? They can use all lawful tactics at their disposal. What they're not allowed to do is violate international humanitarian law or the law of war to achieve their objectives. Now, let's look at the conduct of hostilities. The biggest problem we have when we have discourse on this issue is the constant conflation between what I've called direct cause and legal responsibility. It's easy to identify the direct cause of injury, the direct cause of a civilian death, the direct cause of destruction of property. The side that dropped the bomb is the side that caused that result. But responsibility is what the law focuses on. And responsibility is a much more complicated equation. And when you're fighting an enemy that uses the civilian population as camouflage, as cover and concealment, that violates its own obligation to take constant care to mitigate the risk to the civilian population by avoiding putting its vital military assets in the midst of the civilian population, then in most cases, the responsibility for that civilian suffering doesn't fall at the feet of the side that dropped the bomb. It falls at the feet of the side that set the conditions where there was no alternative other than to inflict those tragic and unfortunate casualties. And this gets to the whole issue of human shielding. I heard Colonel Kemp refer to the idea of human shielding. As Natasha knows, I think what Hamas does is even more aggravated. The whole notion of human shielding presupposes that you don't want your enemy to attack a target. In my view, in many cases, Hamas wants the IDF to launch the attack. They know the IDF will have no option other than to launch the attack, and they want to use that as a way of producing civilian casualties. In a sense, they're using IDF military action and IDF attacks to achieve their goal of killing their own civilians, so they can use those deaths as ammunition in their international misinformation campaign, or to kind of distort the perception of who ultimately bears responsibility. And we see how effective that is. So we shouldn't only be condemning human shielding. Of course, human shielding is a war crime, and their leaders have overtly announced that that's their goal. And that's why they prevent civilians from leaving certain areas. And that's how they're going to use hostages. We should also be condemning the reality that Hamas's operational decisions are designed to create a situation where Israeli military commanders have one or two miserable options. Option one is, because of the risk to civilians or civilian property, I refrain from launching an attack, in which case the enemy gets an unjustified tactical windfall from its own illicit behavior. Option two is that I launch the attack with the knowledge that even though I've done everything to mitigate the risk to the civilian population, I'm inevitably going to cause civilian casualties, in which case Hamas loses the tactical fight, but gets ammunition for its misinformation campaign. And so what people need to understand is that for a commander like Colonel Kemp, information operations always supported his combat mission. But for an enemy like Hamas, combat is the supporting effort to their information campaign. And this gets to the next point. If we are really going to judge legality in the conduct of hostilities, we have to start by understanding that the law is not effects-based. In other words, we don't judge compliance with the law by looking at the effects of an attack. The effects of an attack, particularly when they cause harm to civilians, are certainly relevant in looking at whether or not the attack was lawful. But all of the law of war related to the conduct of hostilities is conduct-based, not result-based. In other words, we analyze the reasonableness of the attack judgment, not the attack outcome. And part of that goes to the obligation to take all feasible measures to mitigate risk to the civilian population. This is what Colonel Kemp was talking about when he was talking about evacuations and warnings and weapons selection and tactics selection and timing of attack. These are operational decisions that commanders use to reduce the risk to the civilian population, even when the enemy is trying to exacerbate it. That, in my view, is the true touchstone of responsible command and legitimacy in war. What efforts are you making to reduce civilian risk in a way that doesn't compromise your military advantage? And this is another widely misunderstood point. I've heard a lot of commentators say Israel has to do everything possible to reduce civilian risk. In fact, what the law requires is feasible measures, and feasibility factors in military advantage. So what you have to do is implement measures that mitigate risk so long as they don't compromise your military advantage. You're not obligated to do things to reduce risk if the cost is that you lose military advantage as a result. And the ultimate irony is the Israeli military does that anyway. They frequently implement measures to reduce civilian risk, knowing full well it's going to increase the risk to their own forces or give some advantage to the enemy, because they're trying in good faith to implement their obligations. If we focus on the decision to launch an attack instead of the results of an attack, the ledger is clear. The law doesn't prohibit killing civilians in war. That's a tragic reality. Nor does it prohibit that result, even if the commander knows it's going to happen. As Colonel Kemp said, I had to make decisions to launch attacks knowing there was no way I could avoid hurting or killing civilians. What the law categorically prohibits is trying to kill civilians, even if you fail to do so. One of the interesting aspects of the public discourse on this conflict is that people talk about Hamas war crimes on October 7th, as if they ended on that day. Every time Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah launches a rocket at Israel, they are committing the war crime of intending to attack civilians. Fortunately, Israel has been relatively successful in preventing those attacks from producing the intended result. But it's not the result that makes the attack illegal, it's the intent. And if you're not intending to harm civilians, and you've done everything you can to mitigate civilian risk, that leads to the ultimate question, which is the proportionality issue. And even here we have confusion, because as Natasha knows, the wartime rule of proportionality doesn't define legality like a close balance, like a police officer using force on the street. We don't arm soldiers with tasers. We arm them with deadly weapons. What the law requires is that commanders refrain from launching an attack only when they assess the risk to the civilian population and civilian property as excessive in relation to their anticipated military advantage. The word excessive suggests a much more significant imbalance than proportionality. Now, personally, I think the law, that rule is so inherently ambiguous that it doesn't really mean much other than what anybody wants it to mean. So we shouldn't be surprised that critics of military operations gravitate towards the proportionality rule, because if I say to Colonel Kemp, you're not allowed to launch that attack if you think the result will be excessive, and he's an infantry commander, he's going to look at me and say, what does excessive mean? And my answer is going to be whatever you think it means. It's not clear, which is why I say again, if we really want to critique the credibility of attack decisions, focus on those precautionary measures and ask yourself a simple question. Has the military, has the commander, has the IDF implemented its obligation to take constant care to mitigate the risk to the civilian population without compromising its military advantage? Those are objective measures that can be assessed. And what we know is that Hamas does everything it can to exacerbate civilian risk. The IDF is doing what it can to mitigate civilian risk and still achieve its legitimate military objective of disabling and destroying Hamas. And one more point I want to make on before I turn it over to you, to Natasha. We always get questions, as you know, and as Colonel Kemp knows, is why should we care about this law if we're fighting an enemy that doesn't care about the law? And the answer to that is twofold. First off, the whole purpose of the law is to mitigate the suffering of victims of war. And the reality is, if you're a civilian living in Gaza, you're already a victim of Hamas because they don't care about you. You're just ammunition for their information campaign. They've run their tunnels under your apartments. They've put their rocket launchers next to your children's schools. They've put their command centers under hospitals. You're already a victim of their indifference, their inhumanity, their disregard for the law. We shouldn't allow that victimization to be exacerbated by the other side saying, I'm now released from my obligations. So it's very important that we remember, no matter how illicit Hamas or Hezbollah or PIJ might be in their conduct, the Israeli Defense Forces, like the UK forces or the British force or the US forces, are not released from their obligation to do the best they can to mitigate the suffering of war. And the other reason why this is important is we have to remember that the people who fight wars are human beings. They have to make incredibly difficult decisions. It infuriates me when I hear people casually throw out the phrase war crime. You see a child who's been killed in an attack, and the immediate response is, oh, Israel is committing war crimes. A state doesn't commit war crimes. People commit war crimes. There is a pilot that flew a mission, that flew home to Israel and is watching the same news. And I promise you that other than the parents of that child, the person who's carrying the moral burden of that decision is no heavier than the burden on that pilot, because these soldiers and their commanders come from a moral society and they're in a terrible situation. So if we're not clear that we understand that they have authority and obligation to do terrible things, that war can be lawful and awful at the same time, we are corroding their own moral integrity. And we should not only demand that they respect the law, we should applaud their commitment to do their best to mitigate the suffering of war in this terrible situation.
Thank you so much for that. I have to say, everything you've both said has reflected my own experience of over the last 10 years watching the IDF's approach to past wars in Gaza, and also that is inevitably reflected in this one. In terms of the legal input into the considerations that you both have described, it's significant that the Military Advocate General Corps sits outside the military chain of command, so that military lawyers are able to make the calls on a strike-by-strike basis in terms of the legal framework that you have set out, and are able to tell perhaps senior officers no-go on strikes on the basis of those equations. And as you say, as a citizen army in particular, that aspect of human beings making these decisions and following a moral ethical code, the IDF purity of arms ethical code, is manifest. There are many questions that have been posed in terms of...
Let me just make one comment in response to that. And this is a compliment to men and women like Colonel Kemp. It is important that legal advisors are integrated into the operational decision-making and execution process. But the law relies primarily on commanders, right? If you look at the qualification to be a privileged belligerent, it doesn't say that you operate under responsible lawyers. It says you operate under responsible commanders. And so it's not just the lawyers that are at the centerpiece, and I would say not even the lawyers. It's the responsibility of military commanders in the IDF, from platoon leaders on the ground in Gaza to the most senior commanders in the National Security Council, to be committed to leading their forces in a way that allows them to preserve their moral integrity. And so I think we owe admiration, not just to the lawyers that are integrated into this process, but to their clients, which are the ones who ultimately bear the responsibility of carrying the burden of battle command.
Jeff, I couldn't agree with you more. May I delve into a few of the legal questions that we've had in the first instance on the question of civilian casualties? I should say there are a lot of questions that have been put about the media's misrepresentation of so much of what you and Richard have covered. We're probably going to have to do a separate webinar on that and the responsibilities that the media carries. But focusing in the first instance on civilians, how does the proportionality equation, and this is the questions coming from the audience, how does proportionality work in circumstances where Hamas prevents civilians from escaping from the areas under attack? We've seen reports of Hamas, of course, bombing civilian convoys heading southward away from the north of Gaza on IDF instructions, and also reports of them gunning down fleeing civilians in the streets. So what impact does that have in terms of the legal framework on proportionality in Israel's approach?
Well, obviously, it makes the judgment that much harder, because what you see one side using precautionary measures to mitigate civilian risk, and the other side preventing those measures from being effective. It doesn't release the commander from the ultimate proportionality obligation. And so somebody like Colonel Kemp is going to have to make a difficult moral judgment at that point. Remember, at that point, those civilians are not somehow quasi-combatants, or they haven't lost their protection. They're still protected. They're still victims of war. But at some point, it becomes unavoidable to be able to achieve your military objective without causing civilian harm. So what do we want the commander to do at that point? To turn to his or her battle staff and say, I want you to give me every option I have to avoid hurting these civilians, knowing full well that I've tried to get them to evacuate and they can't. Can I use a different method of attack? Can I use a different weapon system? Can I time my attack differently? Is there some other military objective somewhere else that I can attack to achieve the same result? And once the commander exhausts all that, then Colonel Kemp has to look into his own soul and say, do I believe that the expectation that 5 or 10 or 15 civilians being killed is justified by what I'm going to get out of this attack? And there are many cases where the commander is going to say, no, I'm just not going to do it. I'll wait for another opportunity because I can't morally justify that loss of civilian life. And so this kind of goes to this whole media narrative. When I see the level of destruction, for example, when I see an apartment building go down, my instinct is to assume there must have been really high value in that target. Because if it was a low value target, I just can't see an Israeli commander saying, oh, what the heck, just blow it up anyway. They're the ones who have to live with this. And that's not an easy thing to do.
I'm bound to say that this is a point that I've not seen raised in any of the discourse so far about LOAC and Israel's operation in Gaza on this occasion, and it's an extremely important point. Richard, in light of the moral approach that commanders are expected to take, can I put this next question to you? It asks, what should our response be to the criticism of some of Israel's politicians in terms of the language used to describe Israel's response to the 7th of October attacks, and of course the continuing rocket fire onto Israeli civilians? Some of the phraseology that has been deployed, in which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, in terms of how Israel will approach its war against Hamas, does seem at odds with the approach of the IDF that we've been discussing. Could you comment on the sentiment perhaps in Israel and how you are able to assess the rhetoric against what the IDF is doing?
Well, I have heard some fairly irresponsible comments made by some political leaders in Israel. I think, you know, in pretty much every time I've heard comments made that I think are out of line, I've also seen the Prime Minister or other cabinet ministers, other members of the War Cabinet, correct and admonish the individuals concerned. So I think, you know, it's the nature, in some ways, it's the nature of Israel, the nature of politics, that people will say stupid things sometimes, but it's very dangerous because, of course, it plays directly into the hands of the predominance of the media, which wants to find Israel guilty of war crimes, and some of those suggestions might indicate that. But I think, you know, where I've seen them occur, they have been slapped down by the Prime Minister. So how should we approach it? Well, I think we should treat it in the same way as some of the irresponsible comments we hear from our own politicians.
I also, Natasha, I don't think it should be shocking. I mean, when countries are, when these type of incidents are inflicted on countries, there's an instinct for political leaders to use bombastic rhetoric. I mean, just look at the commentary from politicians in the United States after 9/11. So I would say the response is to ask a simple question that most trial lawyers would understand. Does the circumstantial evidence align with the statements? In other words, do you see the IDF engaging in practices that corroborate that bombast? And I think the answer is a categorical no. And I also think that we have to remember that this notion of equality of application of the law doesn't imply equality of condemnation. That was the first editorial I wrote after October 7th. There's almost this instinct that if you're going to accuse one side of a war crime, you have to find something to accuse the other side of. No rational person in the world can deny that what we saw on video, what Colonel Kemp saw with his own eyes on the southern border, were war crimes by Hamas. But the immediate reaction was what? Well, now we have to find something to accuse Israel of. That is corrosive, because the law it requires you to follow the same law. It doesn't mean you both have to violate the same law.
I'm bound to say that reflects what I can only describe as a very British sense of both sides, having to approach everything with a sense of both sides in order to appear fair. But of course, as you say, it's an utterly morally repugnant equivalence that is being drawn. Could I ask you?
I think. Can I just say? I think it's that sort of both side aspect is reflected also in comments you hear from people like President Biden, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Prime Minister Sunak, when they're constantly, and you hear it every day, day in, day out, Israel must abide by the laws of armed conflict. Israel must minimize the death of innocent civilians. When they know, these people that are saying that know very well that's exactly what Israel's doing. They're briefed in detail on what Israel's doing. They're not saying that because they believe it to be the case. They're saying it because they want to appease Israel haters, those people who are opposed to Israel defending itself. And I think it's extremely dangerous because it plays directly into the hands of Hamas. As Geoffrey Corn rightly said, Hamas want to use civilian casualties in Gaza as part of their propaganda campaign. And if the implication of what these politicians are saying is that Israel is not adhering to the laws of war, then that plays right into their hands.
Could I pick up on, again, on the issue of civilians? There are reports that presume civilians accompanied and participated with the Hamas terrorists and other terrorists. This is a question from the audience, but perhaps I can supplement it with the clarification that out of the 3,000 terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October, there were, of course, members of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, the members of Fatah, affiliates of the so-called moderates, the Palestinian Authority here. So although this is framed as Israel's war against Hamas, unfortunately it is much broader than that. But Jeff, the questioner asks, in light of those reports that civilians accompanied and participated in the atrocities, how does one go about distinguishing actual civilians from those who committed the terror and perhaps also assist Hamas continued terror attacks and rocket launches since?
Yeah, so let's take it bit by bit. The law requires the Israeli forces to distinguish between members of the enemy armed group, belligerent operatives, and all other persons. And if you're not a member of the group, a member of the belligerent group, the armed group, then you're presumed to be a civilian protected by the law. Now, it's already complicated enough to figure out who is a member of the enemy armed group when the enemy armed group doesn't distinguish itself from the civilian population. They have an obligation to wear something or demonstrate some way that they're not civilians. And that's not, you don't wear camouflage because you're going to hide most of the time. You wear it so that the other side knows who they're allowed to shoot. And so that's already complicated enough. And when you're fighting an enemy that ignores that rule, it inevitably creates greater risk for the civilians because you can make reasonable mistakes. The decision to use force in war is no different than any other context. It's assessed on a standard of reasonableness. So sometimes in battle, you kill someone who shouldn't be killed, and you realize afterwards you made a mistake. That's not a war crime, unless that mistake was reckless or there was some other level of culpability. Now, what about civilians who help the armed group? The law indicates that while they're doing it for such time, they lose their protection from attack. That's called direct participation in hostilities. If they do it routinely, so if every night they're going out to help fuel rockets or implant IEDs, then they're considered to have lost that protection on an ongoing basis. But if you have some civilians who went across the border and contributed to the barbaric attack of October 7th and then went back, they're not lawful targets now, because now they're not continuing to participate in hostilities. If you apprehend them, They all could be prosecuted in Israeli courts. I mean, let's not forget, these were all violations of Israeli law. And by the way, not just Israeli law. If you kidnapped or murdered an American citizen during that attack, or you're continuing to hold an American citizen hostage, that's a violation of federal criminal law. It's a violation of the War Crimes Act, and it's a violation of long-arm counterterrorism statutes. I'm sure other countries like the UK and Canada have other provisions like that. So they're subject to being captured. They're subject to being prosecuted. But we have to be very careful and recognize that a civilian can get involved in an incident. And while they're involved in it, they are absolutely subject to being attacked like the belligerent. But once they spin out of it, their protection from being attacked is restored.
Picking up a further question from the audience, we have a questioner that says, in Israel, we have to wait for a disaster in order to start a military campaign. Under what circumstances is a country allowed to initiate a preemptive attack? And does the Palestinian Authority pay for slay policy justify it? Plainly, there's a difference in analysis between jus in bello that we've been discussing, the law that governs operations when they're occurring, and jus ad bellum, the law governing the legality of the start of hostilities. But can I ask, Richard, perhaps I can start with you, in the context of having to wait for an attack before responding, what's your assessment of the position that Israel is in? There's another separate line of analysis that says, of course, this is a continuing conflict against Hamas. It didn't start on the 7th of October. There was a ceasefire on the 6th of October, which was arguably violated on the 7th. Can you weigh in with some analysis on whether Israel has to sit, wait to be attacked, and only then is able to lawfully respond?
Yeah, I would say the best example of that situation is up in the north today on the border with Lebanon. And there we have about 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel, funded and produced and directed by Iran, but operated by Lebanese Hezbollah. And that threat has been there for a very long time. It's intended as a deterrent against Israel, against the possibility of Israel carrying out an attack against Iran, or the US carrying out an attack against Iran. But nevertheless, it's a direct threat to Israel and Israeli citizens. And we've seen since this war began on the 7th of October, we've seen an intensification of attacks coming from across the border into Israel, killing quite a large number of Israelis already, with Israel carrying out a series of retaliatory attacks, airstrikes predominantly, and artillery attacks. Now, the question is, should Israel wait until Hamas, or Hezbollah rather, launches a massive bombardment against Israel, potentially killing a large number of Israelis, or should Israel preempt that bombardment by launching an attack itself? I'm obviously willing to be contradicted by you legal experts, but I would argue that Israel has every right to carry out a preemptive attack, and it wouldn't actually be a truly preemptive attack, because these weapons have been used to attack Israel in the last few months, in the last few weeks, and even before that. So it's not truly preemptive, but I would say Israel has a legal right to deal with that threat to itself immediately. I think the major consideration here is probably not a legal consideration, but a political consideration as to whether Israel wishes to get itself into a position, if it doesn't absolutely have to, if there isn't a major bombardment from the north, if Israel wants to get itself into a position either during this conflict or once this conflict's finished, of a form of preemptive attack against Hezbollah.
That may lead on to another question, which is posed directly to you, Richard. Why are the Israelis allowing ICBMs from Yemen to go unanswered? Is there another country that would allow this kind of weaponry to be used without some form of response? Do you see there again, the political dynamics, international diplomacy perhaps coming into play, or any other factors influencing that lack of response?
Well, Israel and also the United States has intercepted all of the missiles and drones that have been fired from Yemen towards Israel. And I would say the chances of a missile getting through from Yemen to Israel, to Eilat or wherever, are relatively low. It's possible. It's certainly possible. And yeah, I would argue that Israel again would have a legal right to attack the elements in Yemen that are carrying out these attacks against Israel. I think it's a similar position to Lebanon in some ways. But again, I think that I would guess one of the reasons why Israel does not choose to do that is political, is in terms of, you know, not wanting to widen the conflict any further than it is at the moment.
I mean, this comes down to a basic premise. Just because you may doesn't mean you should. The may is the legal question. The should is the policy question. And actually, what you see reflected, and this is why the assertion that Israel is being overzealous in its exercise of self-defense in Gaza is objectively absurd, because they have a right to act in self-defense in other theaters. I mean, I think there's a plausible argument, and I'd encourage everybody to read Ken Watkins' piece in Articles of War, that there's an ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran at a low level. But the state has to choose what it wants to do, and that's a much more complex issue of politics, diplomacy, destabilization. So what do we see? We see defensive postures in other theaters where Israel is confident it doesn't need to do everything it may do, which supports the argument that what they're doing in Gaza is the result of a decision that they really have to do it, that they have no other option. And if anything, I think the vulnerability on October 7th was the result of Israel assuming risk with Gaza in prior conflicts. I think legally, Israel would have been justified in a much more robust response in 2014, but they chose to be more restrained. And so when you point the finger of blame at Israel for being overzealous in their exercise of self-defense, the history and the context of other theaters objectively rebuts that.
Especially when one operates in the Middle East. And that is, of course, a very different context to Europe or North America in terms of one's neighbours, who are undoubtedly watching Israel's response very closely. Geoff, could I pose this additional question from the audience to you? It reads that the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, stated today, and indeed previously, Israel doesn't have a right of self-defense as it is an occupying power. And the question asks, is that a correct interpretation of international law?
I believe it's an erroneous interpretation. It's not an uncommon interpretation. There have been arguments over whether Gaza remained occupied after the occupation ended for years. If Israel, however, is an occupying power, that means they have the right under the Hague regulations and the Fourth Geneva Convention to maintain security in the occupied territory, which means if there's a dissident armed group or groups operating in the occupied territory, they're allowed to use military force to end that threat. So you can't have it both ways. If you say they're an occupying power, then as an occupying power, they have the authority to destroy Hamas. If they're not an occupying power, then they're acting in self-defense. Now, I don't think you can claim they're an occupying power. And isn't it interesting, Natasha? We hear all the time, Israel is about to reoccupy Gaza. I don't know how you reoccupy something you're already occupying. It's hyperbole, and it's not grounded in valid interpretation of the law. Because if you're going to say that, and I'm not saying that anybody who says Israel has remained an occupying power, I'm not saying that's completely erroneous. That's an interesting debate. But if you're going to say that, you then have to say in the next breath, they have the right as an occupying power to maintain order in the occupied territory, which means to defeat the dissident group that's fighting in that territory.
Yes, unfortunately, I think the critical aspect of the analysis here is that these are political terms, perhaps masquerading as legal analysis, but plainly an agenda, and it all starts to unravel in the situations that you've described. A couple of questions relevant to the concept of siege, and in particular, what about the denial of food and water? I'm reading from the audience, and electricity to Gaza. Is that a war crime? Richard, can I just ask you to pick that up, perhaps in the first instance?
I think again, I'm not a lawyer. You're the lawyers. You know the chapter and verse on this. But my understanding of it is that it's perfect. A combatant is not required to provide humanitarian aid to enemy territory. And for example, I don't think when we were fighting the Germans, anyone was expecting us to provide humanitarian aid to the Third Reich if it needed it. And I don't think it's a requirement here, but I do. My understanding is that if you have a necessity to starve your enemy of whether it's food, water, fuel, then you are legally allowed to do that. But if it's possible to allow food, water, fuel to get through to the civilian population, then you can do that as well. But you're not legally obliged to do so. I don't think, as long as you're not. I think it's much the same as the principles of using lethal force. As long as you're not deliberately intending to starve the civilian population, I think it's lawful to lay siege to a territory in order to starve its military force.
By the way, Natasha, this goes back to that issue of occupation. If you are an occupying power, you do have obligations to provide for the welfare of the civilian population. But people who are making this argument that Israel has an obligation to provide resources, it has the obligation, are pulling that from arguments derived from occupation without even understanding where it's coming from. Now, what Israel does bear is an obligation not to arbitrarily impede the delivery of humanitarian assistance into the conflict zone. But that allows Israel to ensure that there are measures to make sure that, or to be satisfied that the resources aren't going to be diverted. But I would say this, I think we have to be very careful about being too formalistic on this issue of siege. I believe it's clear. The law prohibits intentionally starving the civilian population. So Colonel Kemp is correct. If your military objective is to weaken the enemy, then it's a proportionality assessment. You know it will have an effect on the civilian population. But there's been no evidence of starvation in Gaza. Gaza only got 8% of its water from Israel. Electricity is completely different because you can cut off electricity and still facilitate the passage of some aid to hospitals to keep electricity running for those facilities. When you're dealing with a subterranean enemy, electricity and fuel are critically vital military assets. So there's a logical military necessity to cut that off. Having said all that, the facts indicate that Israel has bent over backwards, I think, to try and figure out ways to mitigate the consequence of this resource deprivation on the civilian population. Evacuate them from northern Gaza, establish humanitarian corridors. Now, I think it's legitimate to ask whether they could have done that more rapidly or maybe more efficiently, but it's the right thing to do because this is also a legitimacy battle. And if you know that you can do something to help civilians get essential resources, to help hospitals continue to function, you should do it. You might not have to do it, but you should do it because ultimately you're going to be judged not just on the formalism of the law, but on whether or not your conduct reflected the values of the nation you represent.
Gentlemen, there are so many questions here, and they are all outstandingly good ones on such a variety of areas. I wish I had you both for an all-day seminar, and I'm not even sure that would be long enough. Can I perhaps just conclude matters by asking you about hospitals and the status that they have? This has come up in a number of different questions from the audience. Where there is evidence, as there has been with respect to a number of hospitals in Gaza, that Hamas has been using them as command and control centers, potentially also keeping hostages in the tunnels beneath them, and been using other civilian protected buildings to launch missiles at civilians in Israel. What does international law, Geoffrey, say about when protected buildings can become legitimate military targets in those circumstances? And then a few final words on that also from Richard thereafter would be wonderful.
Well, let's be very clear that the hospital is the most protected facility in the battle space because it's the only civilian object, or actually the rule comes from the First Geneva Convention and applies to military medical facilities. So even a military hospital, it cannot be attacked even if it's being misused unless there's a warning and a reasonable time to terminate the misuse. But this is an area where there's a lot of confusion, because if you listen to the media narrative, the assumption is you're giving the warning to the hospital and they need time to respond. The warning is not to the hospital. The warning is to the enemy that's misusing the hospital, and you give them a time to comply. And if they fail to comply, then they become a legitimate object of attack. Having said all that, you still bear an obligation to mitigate the risk to the hospital and the patients, to do whatever is feasible to mitigate that risk. So when you see what you see in the news today with Al-Shifa, where there's a limited ground incursion to the subterranean parts of the hospital, that tells you two things. Number one, the IDF warned Hamas to stop using the facility, and they failed to heed the warning, which means that the IDF has the right to take measures to terminate that use. And number two, they're doing it in a way that tries to mitigate the adverse consequence to the hospital itself and the civilians in and around the hospital, which is what we would expect them to do and what we should want them to do. The idea of just blowing the hospital up because Hamas refuses to stop using it, I think, is legally overbroad and ultimately counterproductive.
Perhaps not reflective of the facts on the ground, and even the reporting from the BBC, which today acknowledged, of course, that the IDF is going into Shifa with medical teams and Arabic speakers in order to navigate the very difficult situation of combating terrorists hiding behind nurses, doctors, and sick civilians. Richard, anything that you want to add on hospitals? And perhaps just finally, I know that you've spoken out so many times in international fora for the proper application of international law and recognition of the lengths that the IDF goes to protect civilians in armed conflict. There are a number of questions that comment on proposed prosecutions of individual Israelis in The Hague, the International Criminal Court's investigation. Is there anything that you can say on the threats that are essentially being faced by the soldiers on the ground in light of the approach the ICC has taken, and indeed recent comments that we've had from the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan?
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem that the Israelis face has been developed over decades and decades of anti-Israel propaganda, which has led people to believe actually that almost whatever Israel does, it's in the wrong. Whatever the IDF does, it's in the wrong. And when you hear people like the Secretary General of the United Nations accusing Israel of basically saying this did not happen in a vacuum, this is a result of years of occupation, of apartheid policies, etc. This is a propaganda campaign that has taken hold and is influencing most of the comments made by so many people in the media, many politicians, international organizations, human rights bodies, etc. And what they're saying is in very many cases a gross distortion of reality. And we only just have to look at, for example, at the BBC comments, going back to the Al-Shifa hospital. The BBC reported that the IDF were carrying out raids against Al-Shifa hospital, and they were targeting medical personnel and targeting Arabic speakers. And that was an extraordinary thing for them to say, a distortion of what the IDF did say, which you mentioned just now, which is that they're taking with them medical teams and Arabic speakers, not targeting them. But that could only have come out, that report could only have come out on the BBC if the BBC genuinely believed that such actions were possible from the IDF. So I think, you know, we're looking at a totally distorted picture, which infects the UN, infects the ICC. As far as I can see, Israel is adhering, and I've been, as I said, right since the beginning, Israel is adhering closely to the laws of war, as it always does. I don't believe anybody in the IDF or in the Israeli government has anything to fear in terms of prosecutions for war crimes. I do believe that it's the duty of Israel's allies, like the United Kingdom, the United States, etc., to stand really firmly in support of Israel and, where possible, to rebut these suggestions made by irresponsible people like Karim Khan and the UN Secretary General.
I'm tremendously grateful to both of you, but also I know many of your colleagues that are doing exactly that, and that are calling out the falsehoods and the allegations without foundation. And I do hope that you don't tire of that battle, and tremendously grateful that you've joined us today. And for all of your writing. I know that you've both been putting out fantastic op-eds, which I commend to all of our audience. I only wish there were more time to grapple with this, but perhaps we can arrange future webinars to pick up, especially in terms of where we go after the war has concluded and Hamas is finally defeated. Gentlemen, thank you so much, and I hope that we meet again in much better times.
Thank you, Natasha. Bye, Richard.
Bye, Geoffrey. Thank you.